So good morning, everyone, and I want to welcome, my name is Voss, and I'm the chair of this panel. I want to welcome everyone to Futurity and Fixity in Historic and Contemporary Chinatowns, Discursive and Material Alliances in Chinese Diaspora Communities. This is the first part of a two-panel series. The second one will start at 1:15 this afternoon in the Olympic Room. And it's been organized by myself and Dr. Jean Wantan, who is a visiting scholar at Stanford University this quarter from Wuyi University in Jiangmen, China. And we have organized this panel together in large part to investigate the questions of what are some of the intersections that connect discursive formations and material practices. In other words, how does the rhetoric, both of the anti-Chinese movement and resistance to it, intersect with material practices of alliance, solidarity, resistance, and survivance? But I would be really remiss if I didn't begin by mentioning that one of the things that connects all of us on both this panel and the afternoon panel is that all of us in one way or another have been collaborating with Dr. Tan for several years. And it is through her generosity and the generosity of the Qiaoshan Research Center at Wuyi University that this kind of transnational research is even possible. And so as we've come together to try to build on the insights and methodologies of multi-sited ethnography and other transnational research practices, our goal here today is to try to refuse the compartmentalization that often separates studies of the late Qing and early Republic periods in China and studies of Asian American community formation in North America. So this panel, Futurity and Fixity in Historic and Contemporary Chinatowns, works to resituate 19th century Chinatowns by reframing them, by reframing the history of these communities through diverse temporal, spatial, and material perspectives. And in particular, the research presented this morning asks, in the midst of profound uncertainty caused by imperialism and economic and political unrest in China, how did residents of and migrants from China's Pearl River Delta build alliances with each other and establish new homes and settlements abroad? What futures, both real and imagined, were created through the formation of institutions and networks, not only those that connected Chinatowns abroad with China, but also those that fostered lateral connections among Chinese diaspora settlements. The resulting dialogue, the papers that are being presented this morning, provide a foundation for the second panel this afternoon, which focuses on the role of transnational alliances in fostering resistance to the 19th century anti-Chinese movement. One of the things I also want to mention before I start turning this over to our panelists is that the two panels that are organized today are themselves not only a transnational alliance, but also an interdisciplinary one. Scholars on this panel and the panel in the afternoon represent scholars in history, archaeology, architectural history, food studies, and cultural geography. And we feel that this interdisciplinary collaboration is just as critical as the transnational collaboration in bringing new perspectives to topics that, while they have been central to Asian American studies since the 1960s, nonetheless still bear re-examination through new frames. So with that, our speaker order today, we're going to have Dr. Henry Yu first, and then Dr. Jean Wantan will come next, followed by Ben Baker, and then Dr. Kennedy. And each panelist is going to speak in sequence, and then we'll have open time for discussion at the end after all the panelists have presented. So without further ado, let me introduce Dr. Henry Yu, History Making in the Futurity of the Cantonese Pacific.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks. So I'm going to put my timer on for 15 minutes, right? 15? Okay. And then it's going to go off, and then you can drag me off at that point.
That sounds good.
So let's see. Where's the play?
That's a good question.
Does anybody know what I'm a math person?
You're in Adobe?
Yeah. Is there a way to make it full screen?
Maybe the top right square.
Yeah.
Square? Okay.
The
Scroll bar?
Yeah, that's scroll bar.
There we go.
Up there.
Okay.
Is that better?
Thank you.
All right.
Adobe experts. Well, it still has the browser window, but whatever. Okay. Okay, now you know. Okay. I'm not counting this on mine.
No, we're
Okay. So, thank you, Barb. And thanks for organizing this. So, I just want to reiterate what you said about Celia. So, I'm taking 20 students to Ahoyping in May and June, or actually June. And we've been doing that for like 4 years now. And it's actually, you know, they're going to come back and work in museums in Vancouver. So we're trying to get them to actually understand the sort of rural origins of the farmers who came to Chinatowns all across North America, Australia, New Zealand, and that kind of world view that was being brought and how it quickly adapted to the places they landed. So this talk is in some sense around that. So it's a fancy way. I'm a historian, so actually I don't use words like futurity and things very much. So, so I'll explain why I'm using these kinds of terms, because it's a part of a collection on settler colonial futures. It's called Civic Futures, edited by Warwick Anderson and Miranda Johnson from the University of Sydney in New South Wales. And so they asked to think about this term that's now actually hitting this thing called Histories of the Future, talking about how histories aren't just stories about past time, looking backwards, but also obviously about time in general. And so that's where we get this idea of futurity or histories of the future. So this is the basic, what I'll talk about for the next 13 minutes. So what I was thinking about was the Cantonese Pacific, and I'll explain what that concept is, as a history of the future and a history of the past, but particularly future-oriented, because it's aspirational, it shapes affects and desires for why people leave villages and go all the way around the world. In explaining that, this idea of the Cantonese Pacific, it's also to explain why it clashes so violently with settler colonial ideas of the time and histories that are about land acquisition, about also unbound, timeless story. So it's very, you can formulaically say, the Cantonese Pacific is about unbound space and bounded time. So for them, it's life cycles, affective desires about life cycles of going out in the world and becoming rich, and then maybe eventually returning home to the village or not. It's not bounded space. You can do this anywhere, which is why Cantonese can go anywhere and they can open a store. They can, you know, go through this kind of aspirational life cycle. So unbound space, bound in time. Settler colonial time, just in a formulaic way, is the opposite. It's very bounded in space. So it bounds national states. It creates boundaries. It acquires land, and it's unbound in time. So there was a bar song in the early 20th century, White Canada Forever. And what that meant was Canada, the nation, is forever. Forever in time backwards, erasing Indigenous settlements and ownership of property, and timeless in the future. It will always be Canada, always has been Canada. So it eclipses other narratives of time and history, just as a shorthand. But the Cantonese Pacific is not just an ideology or a narrative of time, it's also a persistent, recurrent, long-distance, localized, singular historical process shaped by these narratives of the past and the future. It is a network phenomenon for those who are migration scholars. It creates routes, it moves bodies, it moves ideas, it moves objects within this large global network. It's a localized, it's not a transnational network. Boundaries don't come until later. It's a translocal network. They connect localized spaces. There are main nodes that are based upon transportation, so the big ports of San Francisco. Even the Cantonese name is the big port, Daifao. Right? There's other ports that are secondary ports. There are hinterlands. So again, think spatially. The Cantonese Pacific is increasingly goes across space. It can go anywhere around the world. It's modular. There's nodes. It's modular in a sense you can replicate the same actions. The technologies such as the small business, the store, the restaurant, the laundry. These technologies are portable, transportable across space, and they are modular. The same techniques allow you to fund a small store in the next town or a cafe in the next town. So affect and desire shape these narratives of the future. It's a bounded story of time around this Gold Mountain guest, this guest of the Gold Mountain, this life cycle that involves migration through unbound space. You can go anywhere. So again, contrasted, as I said, with the sense of settler colonial time. Okay. So So just as a quick thing, you can read this while I'm saying it. Gold Mountain, it's not a place. It's not America. You read again and again, the United States, so the Cantonese name for Canada was Gumsan, or the Cantonese name for Australia was Gumsan. Either these are the most geologically illiterate people in the world, or they actually know what they're saying. They have a name for the United States. They have a name for Canada, the nation state. What they're naming with the term Gumsan is a set of aspirations and desires about going out in the world, leaving the village, and wherever you go, you're trying to acquire wealth, you're trying to acquire opportunities for furthering yourself and your family, and it doesn't matter where you are, if that makes sense. Okay. And if you're a wife of this Gold Mountain guest, then you're a Gold Mountain wife, because you're tied in the village to her or to him. Migrants speaking various dialects, they go out at first to Southeast Asia, from Guangdong and Fujian province for thousands of years, literally. But it's really after the 1500s, as European colonial empires expanded to Southeast Asia, that the nature of the trade networks and the nature of the migration changes. You can ask me about why that is later. We're trying to get away from the stories of inclusion, integration, and exclusion, because those are national stories, and they're generally stories of whether the Chinese belong or not, spatially, in a particular place. Just to give you a sense, a lot of the data and things and work comes through oral histories from the Chinese-Canadian Stories Project, which is a legacy of the federal anthology in Canada in 2006, as well as a databasing project we did with the 97,123 entries of the Chinese head tax. So 4 students had a team of students who went blind that did entering this for 18 months. So the great thing was just like a glorified Excel spreadsheet. We had village origins all the way to destinations. I'm not going to go into this, what is a Cantonese and why that term in English doesn't really match up to something in terms of self-identity. The closest would be actually the term that's used for Chinatowns by the Cantonese when you grow up, Tongyan Gai, they are Tongyan. So they're people of the Tang Dynasty. That's not a term used in other parts of China. And for them, China is Tongsan, or Tonghua is the speech that they speak. So it's a very unique identity. It's not Guangdong, because they think of themselves as Chinese and broad, but they use a different term, and that's the one that we still use for the term for Chinatowns. Okay, so this is data, a bit boring. This is where they came from, the 8 counties, again, mapped. So here's just a quick way of it. Again, affective narratives of time. So what are measurements of time for people who are Cantonese migrants? Contract term. How long before you've paid off your passage? Increments of time. Savings. How much per week can you save up to send home or to buy a share in the store? The ship's arrival. This is a calendar done by the Canadian Pacific, but it shows the arrival times of the next ship. And you can see that's your calendar. And already you see a sense of time in which the arrival of ships, the leaving of ships are the markers of time. Return to the village. How many years will it take before I can save up enough, make enough so I can go get married or buy farmland or go back and visit my mother? Being my own boss. How long before I can have my own cafe or my own, how long before I can buy out my partners or the uncle who's loaned me? How long before I can leave this place, wherever this place is, Jamaica, Cuba, San Francisco, to go back? Maybe back isn't the village, maybe back is Hong Kong, living at large, eating all day and having a mistress. But the return is based also on the idea that you've loaned money to a younger relative who's basically paying you back, and that's your annuity, that's your retirement, your IRA if you're in the United States. So this is the rhythms of time. So this is actually an interesting piece that was observed in 1852. It's and Wally looked live in his work on the Chinese in the Caribbean, found it in the archives in London. And again, I won't read it out, but it's really this British colonial officials' take on comparing Cantonese or Chinese workers with Indian workers, with African workers. And really, the key here is to talk about this incredible desire and ambition that he saw in these Chinese workers, which made them ideal workers, because they were always doing it for themselves. They weren't being forced. They weren't they saw this future which made them work hard, and that was what made them ideal to move into the Caribbean or around the British Empire as workers.
This is from our data. It's a much more interesting way to visualize that. It was done by my colleague Sally Hermanson and one of our students, Edith Tan. She's a geographer. So that shows just the destinations between 1910 and 1923, drawn from about 30,000 data points. This is weighted. And why that's interesting to see is you can see them spread all the way across the Maritimes in every small town. And you can begin to glimpse the kind of modular nature of the technologies that they're using. The small town cafe, the small town laundry, the small town store. You'll see the same pattern in Malaya, you'll see the same pattern in Indonesia, you'll see the same pattern in Indochina. So in Southeast Asia, you'll see it as the Chinese shophouse. Right? Again, I won't get into the architecture of this. This is the New Outlook Cafe in Saskatchewan. That's a manifestation in Saskatchewan. This is, again, GIS visualization of every small town that has Chinese, one or two, versus the major urban nodal concentrations like Moose Jaw and Saskatoon. This is a Gephi analysis done by our colleagues at Stanford, the Spatial History Lab, again, showing what are called edges, like the village to village, clan, and destination edges. This is the naming. What's the Gold Mountain? How do they name places? They have their own vocabulary for places. So we used Trans-Pacific letters in Chinese, and Joanne Kuhn, as part of our Chinese Stories project, just created a map of all the names. It maps up really well with, this is a New Zealand map that was done by a white missionary in New Zealand, just writing down all the Chinese names, or Cantonese names, for places in New Zealand during the gold rush. This is an oral history done by a woman who grew up in Tucson, whose father was overseas in Columbus, Ohio. And so if you want, just Google Chinese Stories, Mrs. Yi, and YouTube, and you'll get Mrs. Yi's story. And why I think it's worth it, there's not enough time today to play it, but if you listen to it, you'll hear her talk about what it was like to be an 8-year-old child when she meets her father for the first time as he comes back in a 3-piece suit with big Gold Mountain chest full of stuff, Singer sewing machine for the wife, and all this stuff for her eventual wedding. She's an 8-year-old girl, and she's got all these wedding gifts for her wedding. So again, the aspirational sense of time, this desire to work so hard to have things for the daughter when she grows up and gets married. Right? It's very interesting to see that this is actually not a bachelor society, because when we see in one place, what we see is we don't see the wives and children. If you only see the village, you don't see the husbands. And so you have to see these together as the Cantonese Pacific, connecting the villages with all these places. Again, as a kind of concluding, parallel history. So the anti-Chinese movements, again, you get idiots, sorry, did I say that? Who are not analyzing this very well, saying the Chinese, they have this culture, and then they go and the anti-Chinese is because they're sojourners and stuff like that, so they kind of deserve to be excluded. Well, actually, there's something going on where, again, sense of nation and time, because it's nationalist movements and the organizing of labor within the nationalist movements that lead to these clashes. But there is something going on in terms of parallel sense of history. And one of the places to see it closest is Chinese are going out into all these areas around the Pacific, and they often do not have much conflict with Indigenous peoples because they are not trying to take their land. They're in fact marrying in often to Indigenous communities. And you can see the long history around in Hawaii with Native Hawaiians, Chinese Aboriginal Australia, Chinese Maori in New Zealand, Chinese Indigenous and First Nations, Chinese Malay, turned into Peranakan in Southeast Asia. This is a different sense of time, space, and what relations you have with people who are already there. One of my students, Sarah Lane, has done a film, All Our Farming Relations, but it came out of an oral history project of Chinese musqueam farms, Chinese on musqueam reserve, and a lot of Chinese farmers from Chungsan. So this is the last slide. 34 seconds. Okay, so just to go over it. So again, thinking what is Cantonese Pacific? In this perspective, it's an aspirational time. It's a way of narrating and giving narrative structure that creates desires of the meaning of time and location, and narrating the relationship of the past, present, and future. These narratives also shape the relationship to space in particular. The aspirational future of Cantonese migrants were basically spatially unbound. They could do it anywhere. Right? Unbound space, generally low conflict with Indigenous peoples in the Pacific region, and initially in Southeast Asia and other areas. It changes after European colonialism begins to spread. I'm going to explain why if you want to know. The conflict with settler colonial nation states is what brings anti-Chinese agitation up to the fore. And it's basically because of a very different sense of space and time. That settler colonial states really care about acquiring land and bounding it and making it fee simple and taking it away from other people. That's the end. Thank you.